What does it mean to say, in the realm of media criticism, that the author is dead? I'm sure folks have heard that phrase tossed around since they were pretentious teens, taking their first wobbly steps toward forming opinions on books and movies. In 2024, I think its usage can be boiled down to, it doesn't matter what the creator of a work intended the audience to take away from it, a piece can still have many alternate interpretations. And broadly speaking, I think that's a reasonable stance. I wouldn't be doing this channel if I didn't have fun extracting my own reads on various tabletop games and putting my own grubby little fingerprints all over their themes. The actual phrase, the death of the author, comes from a 1967 essay by French critic Roland Barthes. There's a lot of parentheticals and asides in the piece that I frankly didn't understand, but its core message comes through, even translated into my vulgar English. Quote, "We know that a text does not consist of a line of words, releasing a single theological meaning, the message of the author God, but is a space of many dimensions, in which are wedded and contested various kinds of writing, no one of which is original. The text is a tissue of citations, resulting from the thousand sources of culture. We know that to give writing its future, it is necessary to overthrow the myth, the birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author." Perhaps, given that Barthes is French, it should not be surprising to hear the author spoken of as a god that needs to be overthrown, that their reign should not merely end with disempowerment, but execution. It's such evocative language to use for a relatively nebulous concept. Ownership and agency over fictional characters shouldn't be that deep. They're not real, what does it matter? And yet, I think there's something truly compelling about that feeling. If you were stuck, drawn, or forced inexorably down a road to hell by a being orders of magnitude more powerful than yourself, what would you do to escape that fate? Death of the Author was written and published by Sam Leigh earlier this year. A spiritual successor to their breakout hit Anais, Author is a tarot-based solo journaling game in which a character struggles to retain agency in a narrative controlled by their creator. Its mechanics are pretty similar to Anais. Players separate the tarot into major and minor arcana, and draw from those decks sequentially, responding to prompts as they do so. You'll create your character, but also a friend and a foe, two additional characters to bounce your story off of. The key to Death of the Author, however, is its mechanics regarding reversal and defiance. In the spirit of giving your character a fighting chance, each chapter you may subvert a given prompt, either changing it to a different prompt or dramatically altering the prompt's core meaning. Since there are 5 chapters in the game, with 3 prompts per chapter, you can only make these sort of changes occasionally. The author is still in control of the narrative, but you're fighting against it, struggling to keep things from going off the rails. A small but important detail in Death of the Author is that both the character and author know about each other. The game begins with the author sending a message to the character, and will continue to send them messages as they progress through their chapters. This creates an interesting dynamic between the two, one which the player is free to interpret. Leigh suggests that this dynamic does not need to be entirely fleshed out at the start of play, but should develop to the point where, at the end, when the character reaches their final chapter, they are fully aware of the author's power over them, and must confront them about what they did to the character's life. It's the seed of resentment and anger that I find so interesting about this game. The character may initially view the author as a god, and by the end, is dead set on making that god understand what they put them through, why they fought so hard to deviate from the path. They're desperate to escape from the suffering that necessarily falls on the characters in a story, and furious that they had to endure such a fate at all. In 2006, a composer named Anais Mitchell adapted the Orpheus myth into a work of musical theater titled Hadestown. After releasing a concept album in 2010, Mitchell eventually managed to get the show to an off-Broadway production in 2016, and the show has since become one of the top 25 highest-grossing musicals of all time. It's one of my favorite musicals, and a genuinely great example of how to incorporate themes, symbols, and motifs into a work. If you're someone interested in doing literary analysis, start with Hadestown. It's just stuffed with possible interpretations. For those of you who don't know, the Orpheus myth is a legend that dates back to ancient Greece. Plato wrote about the story in the Symposium, which was published in the 4th century BC. It's an old song. In it, Orpheus, a poet and son of a muse, falls in love with Eurydice, who tragically dies. Seeking to save his love, Orpheus travels to the underworld and confronts Hades, the god of the dead. Orpheus plays a song so beautiful that even the stone-hearted Hades relents, and allows him to take Eurydice back to the world of the living. However, there's a condition. As they walk back to the surface, Orpheus cannot look behind to make sure Eurydice is following him. And in every version of the story, Orpheus fails. It's a sad song. What Hadestown does that many older retellings of the myth do not is it gives Eurydice a lot more agency. She does not merely die tragically, she makes a choice. Willingly gives up her soul to Hades in exchange for shelter and food, something she's struggled to find her entire life. Eurydice trades her impoverished life with Orpheus for a death with Hades, one where she'll never be hungry, but where she'll have to work forever. And perhaps that is, in a sense, a choice. But in another sense, Eurydice had no other option. The play constantly invokes the presence of the Fates, 3 women who follow Eurydice wherever she goes. The Fates are another common icon of Greek storytelling, more powerful than the gods themselves, spinning their yarns and cutting the threads of life at exactly the right moment. In Hadestown, the Fates are aligned with the weather. They are the winds of change. They are the fickle climate. They are the storm always on the horizon. And Eurydice is powerless to stop them. Hadestown absolutely draws from its Greek origins, but shifts the setting much closer to our current era. With its positioning of Hades as a titan of industry, the use of words such as oil drums and automobiles, and even the name of the play being reminiscent of the Great Depression era Hoovervilles, it's a fair guess to place Hadestown somewhere around the 1920s or 30s. So the show wants us to think of Eurydice as a young woman struggling to get by in a period of economic hardship, one dominated by rich industrialists and climate catastrophe. I'm sure you can relate. In using this Gilded Age iconography, Hadestown also taps into a potent visual and thematic metaphor, that of the railroad. You people watching my videos, you're all RPG fans, you know what it means to be railroaded in play. It's a scenario in which a game master has a plan written out, a story in their head which cannot be deviated from, and no matter how you try as players, you cannot get off the track. Eurydice, too, knows what it's like to be on a journey that she can't escape from. There's a reason the play opens with the cast singing chugga 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 chugga. Opens with an acknowledgement that there is a railroad line on the road to hell. The Fates have decreed that Eurydice will die, and there ain't a thing that you can do. Eurydice is part of an old song, a mere character in a world of wicked godlike authors. Her story is older than all the empires that have risen and fallen since it was first penned. Every time it is told, the story ends the same way. It's a sad song, but we're going to sing it again. The idea that the author is dead, to the contemporary viewer, may seem like a pretty banal declaration. You wouldn't be watching a video essay about an inherently subjected medium if you weren't interested in the ways in which a work's audience necessarily transforms said work with their own beliefs and motivations. But there's absolutely a segment of people for whom the notion of subjective interpretation of media is akin to heresy. Any guesses? On this channel? Oh, you know it's going to be the Tradcaths. 6 years before Barth's essay, famed children's author and most wedgiable Englishman of the 20th century, C.S. Lewis, wrote An Experiment in Criticism, a relatively short but astonishingly pompous treatise which, according to Wikipedia, argues that books are good when they're able to be reread. Which is a weird take, but fine, sure. My particular bone to pick comes from Chapter 3 of Experiment, How the Few and the Many Use Pictures and Music. Throughout, Lewis argues for the audience of a text to be open to the message it is trying to impart. Quote, "We must not let loose our own subjectivity upon the pictures and make them its vehicles. We must begin by laying aside as completely as we can all our own preconceptions, interests, and associations. We must look and go on looking till we have certainly seen exactly what is there. We sit down before the picture in order to have something done to us, not that we may do things with it. The first demand any work of any art makes upon us is surrender. Look, listen, receive. Get yourself out of the way. End quote. Through this self-abnegation, Lewis believes the audience of a work can fully understand its meaning, and therefore, after allowing its truth to be revealed to them, make a determination upon its quality. Lewis is also a pretty staunch believer that there is an objective quality to media, a goodness or badness that is able to be determined once one properly receives its message. It's this belief in the objectivity of a piece that I think is appealing to conservative Catholics. To quote On Authorial Intent by the Catholic intellectual, quote, "If we consult the mainstay witness throughout traditional Christianity, a relationship with the author is absolutely central to understanding his word. This is our Father's world, after all." End quote. It is appealing, for a certain kind of person, for objective quality to exist. There must not be subjective interpretations of a work. There is only what the author intended for the message to be. It is incumbent upon us as the audience to empty ourselves in order to receive that message and to be grateful for it. I know this is a long way around to making fun of C.S. Lewis, but I think that there's something worth considering when we think about why the primacy of an author figure is so central to one's ideology. If there is a single objective world, one which is designed by a single objective being, then everything that happens in that world is purposeful, intentional. There is no such thing as an accident. There is no such thing as ambiguity. Everything happens for a reason. When you allow people to start making their own reads, interpreting stories through alternative lenses, then things aren't quite so black and white. And that, for a certain kind of person, is terrifying. Because what would it mean if the author wasn't right? Would all the suffering in the world, the countless tragedies that make up human existence, dead harvests, starving nations, the constant rising of the ocean, would that all mean nothing? That's why I think people cling so hard to authorial intent, why it's necessary for characters to undergo calamity and struggle. Because the story is all going somewhere. The author has a plan. It'll all turn out in the end. It has to. If not, prayer is just a plea to an unfeeling creator for a better ending. Metalepsis is a 2-player game originally published by Superdillin in 2023 under the title, How Does That Work? You're a Bicycle. The indie RPG scene remains unmatched in its naming conventions. Like Death of the Author, Metalepsis concerns itself with a conversation between a fictional protagonist and an author who controls their fate. The game plays out across 3 acts, beginning at an important moment in the protagonist's story. The author will draw from a standard playing card deck, and use the prompts in that deck to shape the end of the protagonist's narrative arc. Pretty similar to Author, however, the key difference can be found in the definition of metalepsis, which the game defines as, quote, a deliberate transgression between the world of the telling and the world of the told, end quote. How that practically plays out in metalepsis is that, in between beats in each act, the protagonist will appear to the author, confronting them a total of 3 times. Each time, the same questions are asked. Does the author accept that it is the protagonist truly speaking to them? Does the protagonist understand who the author truly is? In this deliberate transgression between creation and creator, the protagonist has the opportunity to express their feelings, to ask why things have come to this lowest of points. They may not understand immediately why terrible things are happening to them, but they can at least push back against the force that is causing such misery in their life. The protagonist might question whether they have a choice in this story at all. And even more importantly, the author can decide whether they feel comfortable relinquishing control over that story. But the thing about Metalepsis, as pointed out to me by the Tabletop Book Club podcast, is that it's an unequal playing field. The protagonist can ask the author for agency, but the mechanics of the game do not allow that agency to be easily seized. At the end of each of the game's 3 acts, the author and protagonist compare cards they've been drawing based on how their conversations have gone. The protagonist gains cards when they appeal to the author's goals and give them pause, and the author gains cards when they force the protagonist to defend their personhood. When they compare cards, the protagonist gains 1 favor if the 2 cards have a matching face or number, and the author gains favor if their suits match. The math there is pretty bad for the protagonist, seeing as only 4 of 52 cards will have a matching face or number, whereas 13 of 52 cards have a matching suit. Over the course of 3 acts, the author is more likely than not going to accumulate the favor they need to influence the final outcome of their story. Each time the protagonist appears to the author, they know the odds are not in their favor. Metalepsis, unlike Death of the Author, is not a game about forcing a creator to come to terms with the suffering of their creation. It is a game about pleading, begging for someone to let them off this ride, that they will not have to walk the road set before them. Eurydice, compelled by the fates, makes her choice. She leaves Orpheus, a poor poet, who, in the relentless pursuit of his magical song, neglects his wife. She goes hungry. She grows cold. Hades offers her refuge from the winds of fate that have blown her across the world. Wouldn't you have done the same? But again, it's not a choice, not really. Eurydice is a pawn in a game bigger than she can imagine. The fates, elemental in their power and fickle with their favor, force her into an impossible position. Eurydice must remain on track, and Orpheus must follow. Orpheus tries his best, he really does. He's the son of a muse, beloved by the gods. He has a gift. He does, in the end, find his song. He walks the secret road to hell. He doesn't need to take the railroad. He finds another way. He breaks through Hades' wall and begs him to let Eurydice go. Orpheus is blessed. His song moves the king's stone heart. Hades agrees to let them leave. It should have worked. But even with all Orpheus's godly gifts, even with the blessing of the Lord of the Underworld, fate cannot be opposed. The story must be told. The train must keep on track. So Hades, compelled by the fates, adds his caveat. They must make the journey in reverse, walk out of hell, Orpheus in front, never able to look back at Eurydice as they march. She reassures him that she's right there, right behind him in the dark. But because she's made her choice, Orpheus is racked by doubt. Doubt the fates themselves whisper into the back of his mind. She already left once because he left her out in the cold. Why would she follow him again? They almost make it. But they don't. The fates have their way. The story must stay on track. They told us at the start of the play. It's an old song. It's a tragedy. The way Hadestown ends is with an acknowledgement that the story is what it is. It doesn't have a happy ending. The song was written long ago. Don't ask why, that's how it goes. But the play highlights the fact that, despite this sad story dating back millennia, we keep telling it. We know how it's going to end. But we sing it anyway because, well, maybe this time it'll be different. We know Eurydice is doomed by fate. We know the road to hell is a railroad line. We know that the story hasn't changed in the 2,400 years since it was first put to paper. The authors of the story have decreed that Orpheus will turn around. The narrative cannot change. But maybe, just maybe, this time it will. And I think that tiny, desperate hope, that plea to the narrative gods, is at the heart of games like Death of the Author and Metalepsis. These texts are keenly aware of the linear nature of stories, of how the most basic writing principles always involve putting their subjects through the ringer, because that is how things go. But Metalepsis allows its protagonist to beg for their life. Author allows its character to exact vengeance for their suffering. These games are keenly sympathetic to the plight of the people we tell stories about, because to be a main character is to be subject to tragedy. Shouldn't, at least once, things turn out all right? I was lucky enough to see a live performance of Hadestown the week I wrote this script. And right at the climax of the play, the moment when Orpheus turned around, someone a few rows away from me let out an audible gasp. And I think that's such an earnest reaction, one that's exactly the kind of response the show hopes to provoke. They told us up front it was a sad song, and yet my fellow audience member couldn't help but hope otherwise. Death of the Author and Metalepsis are, fundamentally, games about agency in the face of tragedy. Metalepsis, I feel, is more in line with the truth of Hadestown. The odds are stacked against the protagonist. It's highly unlikely they can do anything but grapple with their fate, try to break that fourth wall, and beg their creator to spare them. Where Metalepsis embodies the grief of tragedies, Death of the Author taps into rage. It squarely blames the author for the suffering of its character. It knows that, in stories, there is going to be hardship, but that hardship can be laid at the feet of the storyteller, and it curses them for it. Be it a capricious god, the winds of fate, or just the narrative the author intended, Death of the Author seeks a reckoning with the forces that decree how stories ought to end. When the character reaches their final chapter, they give voice to the anger that springs from Metalepsis' sorrow. The character must say their piece, or act without mercy, or both. What makes both Death of the Author and Metalepsis work, I think, is the same impulse that made the audience member gasp at the end of Hadestown. There is a genuine empathy that we feel for the characters in a tragedy that, because we too have suffered, is impossible for us to shake. To be alive is to be subject to the winds of fate. Whether you believe that's because a divine author has decreed it to be that way, whether you think you're the protagonist of your own narrative, or whether you think that's just how it goes, there's a part of us that wants to take agency back from stories that are out of our control. And when we see characters in that same boat, even though we know there's nothing we can do, even though the story's ending was determined long ago, we cling to the hope that things could be different. These games are about the possibility of change, even in the face of cosmically overwhelming odds. Maybe, if we beg the author, if we demand fate bend to our fury, we can derail the story, jump the track, and find our way to a better ending. Maybe. Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate anyone who takes the time to see what I'm saying about tabletop games. If you want to help me keep the channel going, you can send me a tip at my Ko-Fi in the video description. My background picture is Liquefied Image by Adrian on Unsplash, and my profile picture is by Eater Outsider on Tumblr. If you want to find more of my work, I'm at aavoigt on Blue Sky, Monster Factory Fanfic on Tumblr, but my main site is aavoigt.com, where I talk about games and writing. I also do a podcast, Mortified the Friendship Quest, where me and my friend Leigh do critical media analysis, although our most recent episode was just us doing the Hot Ones Hot Sauce Challenge, so check that out if you want to watch me be in pain for a little bit. Thanks as always for watching. Until next time, see ya.